What's going on, everybody? It is time to do a video I've been wanting to do for a minute now. Uh, this is a completely blind review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I've never in my life watched an episode of the anime until I started to read the manga. After reading the manga, I did watch like the first two episodes of the anime, and I may end up watching more now that I've read the first part of the manga. But before starting the manga, I'd never read or even like consumed any JoJo's Bizarre Adventure media. But like I've known about it since like the early 2000s because I remember like getting into like anime and whatnot around that time, and I knew kids going when I was in high school that were into like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But the art style, it was like I think the Jotaro era was really popular when I was in high school. And I remember seeing that artwork and I was thinking like, no, I'm good. I was just like, no, that's not for me. But, like as I've gotten a lot older and as I've, been surrounded by more and more art and more manga, I decided that it was time to finally check out JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And I finally read it, and I'm kind of bummed that I waited this long to check it out because it is legitimately some of the greatest manga I've ever read. And compared, like the manga compared to what I saw of the anime, the artwork in the first part of the manga that Araki, created is amazing. Like it is some of the most incredibly detailed and beautiful artwork I've ever seen. And I'm sad that I waited this long to check it out because of how amazing it is. And it's just funny, like seeing these huge muscular dudes like pirouetting as they fight each other and making like these dramatic as hell poses. And it was such a wonderful experience for me, like because of the fact that like I went in blind. Like I've never read any JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, as I said before. So I really want to talk about it. I wrote like these massive scripts. I wrote 3 separate scripts for the 3 parts, for the 3 volumes of part 1, and I'm going to share it all with you right now. And I just really wanted to share that really quick, my experience going into it and how amazing it was. And I don't want to make this intro too long. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to talk endlessly over the panels and kind of go over what I read. And yeah, I loved it so much. So let's knock this out. I'm really excited to share my thoughts on this. And if you're a fan of the series, I'd love to know your thoughts. Please no spoilers if possible, because I've only, as of right now, read this first part. I do have parts 2 and 3 though, so hopefully I'll be able to jump on those soon. But let's do this. Let's review JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1. This is the series I've been putting off reading for years, and finally I decided the time had come to give it a shot. And what a solid choice that was, as this is one of the most bombastic stories I've ever read, with some of the most eccentric characters I've ever seen in a story. I don't think I've read anything as outrageous as JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I'm a person who prides themselves on reading weird manga or even talking about manga a lot of people aren't talking about. JoJo's is pretty well known, and with good reason. The story is solid and the artwork and sense of style is there. Not to mention, all around, it's a 10 out of 10 pitch perfect story. At least those are my feelings about part 1. As of this writing, I have not yet embarked on the journey set forth in part 2. From the opening to the closing pages, this story is legitimately insane. The basis of Jonathan Joestar is literally Sylvester Stallone, and knowing that, I couldn't unsee it whenever I looked at him. Even right now, as I write this review, I don't know what to tackle first. There are countless elements present in the story, and talking about it is going to be a lot of work and hopefully a lot of fun. What I want to focus on, though, are the meat and potatoes of the series, its characters. JoJo's characters are on a whole other plane of existence. I feel as though I've been sleeping on a masterpiece. JoJo's has some of the most eccentric people I've ever seen in a manga, from Speedwagon the Meddler to Antonio Zappelli and Dio Brando. JoJo's supporting cast are nut jobs, but they're so much fun to read that you can't help but want to turn the page. I think my favorite character ended up becoming Zappelli, who taught Jonathan Joestar about the Nen-like ability, Haman. We even meet Jack the Ripper, and he becomes a subordinate of Dio Brando, but that's getting way ahead of ourselves. Instead, let's take it back to book 1 and work our way up from there. Our introduction to the story and the characters begins with ritual sacrifice, carried out by what are presumably Aztecs. The head of this clan ritualistically murders a woman and with her blood activates a stone mask. He dons the mask and tendrils sprout from the back of it, latching onto his head. This seems to inject whichever poison or physiology-altering chemicals are contained within it into his body. Whatever the case, it makes him ultra strong and vampire-like as he sucks the life force out of one of his men through physical contact. We flash forward hundreds of years to the 19th century, 1880. First, we meet Dio Brando, who is beside his father on the man's deathbed. Dio is waiting patiently for his old man to bite it, and in his last moments on this mortal plane, Dario Brando tells Dio about meeting a wealthy man over a decade prior and saving his life. Dario was in truth trying to rob a carriage that had flipped and the passengers were presumed dead, though there is a sole survivor, and then that man's newborn son begins to wail as well. Dario is mistakenly thanked for saving them as if it were altruistic. In a way, Dario really does save the man, Lord Joestar, and his son, who will one day become Dio's lifelong rival, Jonathan or Jojo. Upon Dario's death, Dio sets out to go live with the Joestar family. He has one specific goal in mind: take Jonathan's place as the sole inheritor of the Joestar fortune. Dio, for lack of a better term, is an asshole, but he is an entertaining asshole. He quickly becomes one of the best parts of the manga. His over-the-top persona and flair for the dramatic make him instantly recognizable. He kind of even looks like Nature Boy Ric Flair in his heyday. He also has a penchant for speaking about himself in the third person. There are plenty of reasons to despise Dio, but he's too entertaining to truly hate. It definitely feels like Araki had a blast writing that character. Upon first meeting Jonathan Joestar, Dio's plan is set into action. He kicks Jonathan's dog and then beats Jojo up and takes his lunch money. Dio is fully intent on breaking Jojo. I remember feeling pretty bad for Jojo in the first act of his life. All he did was get beat to a pulp. Still, his determination did not waver. Dio did some truly horrendous things to him, and on purpose, each time. Dio indirectly killed Jonathan's dog by wrapping him up and putting him in the furnace. It isn't until the groundskeeper actually sets the fire in the furnace the next morning that the dog is burned alive. Dio also turned all of Jojo's friends against him. He even stole Irina's first kiss to further add insult to injury. However, Irina finds the kiss so utterly revolting she washes her mouth out with muddy water. This injures Dio's oversized ego. That stolen kiss was the final straw for Jojo, who storms into the manor and beats the hell out of Dio, leading to their first big fight. In the scuffle, the stone mask, which the Joestar family now has possession of, falls from the wall and the tendrils are activated when a splash of Dio's blood lands on it. No one seems to see it happen though, and the reason I say they are in possession of it and not own it is that I don't believe the stone mask can have an owner. It'll get passed around and claim its victims, but none has ever risen above it who has worn it. Instead, those people have become slaves to it, bent by its nefarious will. There are several passages of time throughout part 1, with the characters going from young boys to about 17 or 18-year-olds. At some point, they seem to become pretty close friends, though it's only an act on Dio's part. Dio is still scheming, still plotting his win over Jojo and stealing the Joestar fortune for himself. Over the years, Jojo has been studying the stone mask. He's done extensive research, learning about its history and attempting to determine its origin. Dio also happens to have a particular interest in the mask and has been secretly reading Jojo's notes about it. He takes it out one night to test its effectiveness and uses it on a Cockney who then becomes unbelievably strong, but also zombie-like. It seems as if the wearer of the mask isn't of a strong enough will. It completely overtakes them, reducing them to zombies. Dio is forced to fight this figure and narrowly escapes with his life. Day breaks, killing the zombie vampire hybrid, like a lesser vampire, feral. Behind the scenes, Dio has been keeping Lord Joestar sick, like Misha Barton in The Sixth Sense. Dio has been seeing a mystic who has continually sold him a powdered poison he then puts into Lord Joestar's tea. There are several moving parts in this tale, and I'm going to include the conclusion of the first act in this first part. What I'm referring to is the burning of the Joestar estate. Before we get to that point though, let's dial it back to Jojo going after Dio into London. Even the carriage driver that takes Jojo there refuses to enter beyond a certain point, and with good reason, because as soon as Jojo enters, he is immediately happened upon by ruffians, the leader of this band being a man named Speedwagon. Like Dio before them, they do their best to break Jojo, but in the ensuing years since his childhood, Jojo has become unbelievably strong, like Mr. America, big-ass bulging muscles, and why not? As stated before, he is modeled after Sylvester Stallone, or just the general physique of the 80s film stars like Stallone or Schwarzenegger. Speedwagon, finding something special within Jojo's resolve, forbids his gang from laying a finger on the young man, and in a weird way becomes Jojo's sidekick for the rest of the first part of this series. Dio's plan to continue poisoning Lord Joestar is quelled by Jojo himself. Even Speedwagon is there for the final confrontation of this first act. I found it hilarious when Speedwagon included his nickname in his own intro, calling himself Speedwagon the Meddler, as he in this case is meddling in other people's affairs. After trying the stone mask out on the Cockney man, Dio decides to use it on Jojo. That was his original intention anyway, but he needed a guinea pig first, and it nearly cost Dio his life. Sunlight is ultimately what saved him, killing the vampire as soon as the rays hit his face. The Cockney vampire immediately burst into dust. Jojo and Dio have their first real life or death brawl in a room surrounded by the police, Speedwagon, and Lord Joestar. Dio, however, being the underhanded scumbag that he is, throws a knife at Jojo. It is Lord Joestar that's ultimately stabbed. This is where Volume 1 ends, but I want to take it further. I want to include the whole affair in the Manor. In a last-ditch effort to save himself, Dio dons the mask as police open fire on him. He goes through the window, mask on, and falls into the snow. This part of the story was quite enjoyable, seeing the way in which Araki articulated the action, these big-muscled men moving swiftly and elegantly as they danced around each other, though their dance was one of life or death. Dio becoming a vampire felt like the right choice. It definitely made sense given he sought after wealth and power, and while he wouldn't have the wealth, not right away, he would most certainly have the power, and with that strength he could do whatever he wanted and take whatever he wanted. The final brawl in this scene between Jojo and Dio was exquisitely drawn and detailed. I like that the original Japanese was kept for the sound effects. Not all manga keep the original Japanese sound effects, which I feel takes away from the experience, though it isn't detrimental to it. As Dio and Jojo fight, the mansion burns all around them, having been set ablaze by an injured Jojo and Speedwagon. Speedwagon in this section was hilarious, providing the most dramatic commentary of the ensuing fight, reminding me of DBZ characters. Everyone standing around in a room miles away, sweating buckets as Goku fights Cell or someone else. Originally, a curtain is set ablaze to trap Dio in it, but soon the rest of the manor goes up in flame. As the mansion crashes in all around them, Dio and Jojo continue their fight to the death. Eventually, Jojo manages to impale Dio on the pointed end of a statue, in a scene reminiscent to Michael impaling David on a set of horns in the film The Lost Boys. I found the burning of the manor to be symbolic, as it closes the first phase of Jonathan's life, and so a new chapter must open. With his childhood home aflame, so ends Jonathan's innocence. For now, the threat is vanquished, with Speedwagon carrying Jojo to safety. His wounds are tended to by Arena, setting up a rekindled love. However, this is only a minor reprieve, as there is more death and mayhem yet to come. I think part 2 is where it really started to take off, because part 1 was so much of the, Jonathan and Dio getting to know each other, and then part 2 is where they're like a little older, and then we're introduced to what is essentially one of my favorite characters that I've ever met in any media that I've consumed. And that is right here, this dude right here is Zappelli, whose name is like taken from Led Zeppelin. But he's legitimately one of my favorite characters. Like, I think Dio was the winner just because how much of a character Dio is. But I think Zappelli is like my second favorite character. So let's do it. Let's check out part 2. And now we welcome Antonio Zappelli to the show. At first, when I saw him on the Volume 2 cover art, I thought him a ringleader. I imagined Jojo joining the circus. Then we finally meet this magnetic man, and he fits right in with this strange concoction of characters. Zappelli, though basically middle-aged, moves light as a feather, zipping this way and that, and with a quick motion he digs his fingers into the joints of Jojo's arm, broken during the fight with Dio, and in the blink of an eye, he mends it. Zappelli uses an ability called Haman, which I've already likened to Nen from Hunter x Hunter. If you have never seen or read Hunter x Hunter, Nen is a chakra-based ability with different layers and varying styles depending on the user and the user's latent abilities. Haman seems a little more straightforward than Nen though. Nen has several subcategories, but Haman seems to be the same for everyone. It depends on the person, how they utilize it, and to what extent. Zappelli has his own reasoning for helping Jojo. He wants to see the stone mask destroyed because his father was consumed by it and killed everyone aboard the ship he commanded. Zappelli, being the sole survivor of that tragedy, just a young man at the time, has vowed to avenge his fallen friends and father. Historical serial killer Jack the Ripper comes to work under Dio, though he's more a zombie than anything. He's controlled by Dio and the effects of the stone mask. Still, Jack the Ripper thus far has been the most out-of-the-box character I've met yet. He somehow burrows into a horse and kills it from the inside out. He also sprouts scalpels from his body like a Bizarro World Wolverine, and uses his muscles to propel them forward. The amount of time and effort, and more than anything, the imagination that went into it is something else. You have these heavily muscled men essentially pirouetting as they fight each other like dancers in a ballet, only their stage is a tunnel and their audience is a serial killer. As over the top as the story is, it is also brimming with style, and not just the fashion sense the characters all employ, but the slick way in which fights are choreographed. Jojo is forced to fight the zombified Jack the Ripper solo, and all the while holding a glass of wine in one hand. Zappelli says to Jojo, "Spill a smidgen of that wine, and even if you defeat him, I will abandon you." While this fight was over pretty quickly, the conflict that comes next turned into one hell of a strength showcase. We have Dio luring our gang, Jojo, Zappelli, and Speedwagon, into a trap, using a young pickpocket as bait. Soon the three are enfolded into an all-out brawl for their lives. Dio, since donning the stone mask, has become an unruly powerhouse. He easily overpowers the whole crew, including Zappelli, splitting his arm open in a Green Room-esque move. Dio can negate Haman energy by draining his own blood from certain parts of his body. When the point of contact is made, it does all of nil damage. Dio standing atop a boulder striking big boss poses reminded me of DBZ or Naruto, Madara Uchiha versus the 5 Kage, which is also one hell of a fight. I like Speedwagon, even though he's essentially the Yamcha of this series. He's turned into a comedic relief, though I'm not certain that was the point of his character. He does make himself useful at one point by opening his guts and letting Zeppeli rest his arm inside so it can heal, as if he were a tauntaun. Dio, feeling as though he's much too powerful for Jojo and company, decides to leave them as playthings for his underlings, two undead knights from history. Pretty sure they're fictional figures, but the queen they served was very real, and these knights, Tarukas and the Dark Knight Bluford, served her and were slain for it, each roiling with boundless hatred for the world that forsook them and saw them beheaded. These men undertook the most grueling of trials to become top of their ranks, taking on a challenge in which each had to kill 70 men apiece and claim from them an anklet or wristband. Only 5 total men had won this brutal exchange, Tarukas and the Dark Knight Bluford amongst them. Bluford was definitely my favorite of the two, not as big as Tarukas, but he made up for it with cunning and his long hair he used as an extension of himself. He could legit grab a sword with his hair, which I think perfectly complements the insanity of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Bluford gains a sense of clarity when coming into contact with JoJo's Haman energy and soon yields his whole attack, blade inches from JoJo's neck. He is bested and goes smiling into the afterlife. The Dark Knight Bluford remembers the pain of manhood and why he fought in the first place. It was a solid moment of a man coming to his senses and giving up his hatred. Wherever he steps, flowers bloom, a result of the Haman. As he withers away into nothingness, he does so peacefully. The artwork in this manga that Araki has drawn so exquisitely, so finely detailed, is the true champion of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Each kick, punch, stomp, and even broken window or smashed walls are drawn with such amazing detail that I can't help but be mesmerized. I took my time getting through the series, and I don't regret it at all because I was able to consume it at my own pace and to, get to meet these characters and get to know these characters and to grow attached to them. And I definitely liked this first part a lot. So part 2 is really gonna have to live up to, what I read in part 1 for it to maybe take the space of part 1 in my heart. Because I love these characters so much. Like Dio, who's just an absolute nutcase, and Zeppeli, who's probably my favorite character in there. And then Jojo, Jonathan Joestar, I think was a solid character. Speedwagon was such an entertaining dude as well. Speedwagon with his whole, with his nickname, it was the Meddler. He's like, I'm Speedwagon, the Meddler or something. It's just, every character in this series has just been an absolute joy, and I hope that part 2 will keep up the energy and the insanity that was presented in part 1. And now we're going to talk about the last volume, the 3rd volume in part 1. So let's rejoice as we close this out, and there won't be an outro for this. We're just going to, after the panels, it's just going to end, and that'll be it. So I want to say, before we close this video, I want to say thank you for watching. It has meant the world to me. I know this is going to be a long video because I wrote a ton of scripting, but let's close this thing out. This is the final volume of part 1 for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Zeppeli is training in Tibet with his sensei Tonpetty at the age of 25. He's given the choice to continue his training, the results of which will inevitably lead to his demise. He still has the chance to change the course of his life, go down a different route. The training Zeppeli is set to undergo is rigorous, something called Celestial Gate. Zeppeli wants to know where his life will end, and by what means. He figures he has the right to know, since this seems to be the path he is set on taking, no matter what. if it means destroying the stone mask that has ruined his life and taken away everyone he held dear, including his father. Should he continue down this path upon which he was set, he would die in a filthy dungeon that stank of death, saving a young chained lion. So it was foretold, and so it came to be. After Jojo's fight with the Dark Knight Bluford, he is now up against Tarukas, who is twice the other man's size and twice as vicious. Tarukas ensnares Jojo in a trap with a chain and clasp that wraps around Jojo's neck. They are both connected via this chain. Each time the hulking Tarukas moves, Jojo is inevitably taken for a literal ride. Speedwagon, Zappelli, and the pickpocketing boy, who has now been released from Dio's spell, plot a way to get into the dungeon to save Jojo. Zappelli is resigned to his fate and means to enter the dungeon by any means. The pickpocket is the smallest and will fit most easily into the grating above the dungeon. His task is to reach a lever on the other side of the room and pull it before he can be killed by Tarukas. No easy task. Tarukas does nearly succeed in killing the boy, but he just barely manages to pull the lever, opening the mouth of the dungeon. The chains Tarukas uses to ragdoll Jojo are wrapped around Zappelli as he enters the chamber, and he is cut in half. However, Zappelli's hand touches Jojo's, and in doing so, he gives Jojo all of his life force, his Haman overcharging the younger man. Jojo, with his newfound strength, breaks his shackles and proceeds to obliterate Tarukas, leaving nothing behind but smoking armor. Jojo and Speedwagon shed a tear for Zappelli, but they have to keep moving. The final battle yet awaits. Again on his journey to take on Dio and put an end to his reign once and for all, Jojo comes across a man he assumes to be another zombie. They fight for a few panels, and the stranger reveals himself to be a former colleague of Antonio Zappelli's. His name is Dyer. Ton Petty, Zappelli's former mentor, and his subordinates show up to help in the fight against Dio. It's going to take a hell of a lot of brawn to take on the overpowered vampire. It gets much more graphically violent from here, with a woman begging for her child to be spared becoming a zombie. Dio grants her wish, and as soon as she becomes a vampire, she eats her own babe in a pretty brutally vicious scene. Dyer tries to fight Dio and is frozen solid. Dio has the ability to nullify Haman energy and freezes it in the user's veins. In doing so, he also freezes entire sections of the body, from arms to legs or even torso. Dio completely engulfs Dyer in it and shatters him like glass, or like Liu Kang in the original Mortal Kombat when he obliterates Sub-Zero. Then comes a moment we've been waiting for, the showdown between Jojo and Dio. Given the journey Jojo embarked on, this fight feels earned, even though he's still grossly outmatched by the much more powerful Dio. It felt like a pretty well-paced fight, with the advantage jumping between the two foes, only to have each pull a trump card every time the other is about to win. Jojo downward slashes with the sword Bluford gave him, pluck and luck, cutting Dio from shoulder to his midsection. However, he is then frozen in place. While having run Dio through, the end of Jojo's sword is resting over an open flame. He uses that fire to unfreeze his arms and punch Dio in the face, which then freezes his arm all over again. Despite the odds stacked against him, Jojo is still able to come out on top as he sets one of his fists into a burning chalice, then combines that fist with his frozen one, and together he does like a Kamehameha meets Double Dragon Haman push and blasts right through Dio's defenses. Jojo punctures a hole through Dio despite the other man's much stronger aura. Dio even goes as far as to refer to Jojo as less than a man, calling him a monkey. In a last-ditch effort to go down fighting, taking his lifelong adversary with him, Dio shoots his life force out of his eye, like a propulsion laser cutting through Jojo's hand and arm. It takes out two of the grotesque vampirelings behind Jojo. Jojo even comments, "A little more to the right, and the beam of energy would have shot right through his brain." Dio falls from the balcony of the castle, his body disintegrating on the way down. At the last possible instant, before he becomes nothing, Dio severs his own head. Unbeknownst to everyone, one of Dio's underlings, Wang Chan, picks his head up and takes it along, set on finding a host body for it. For now, Jojo has won. Even with all of this, all the pain and agony and everything and everyone Dio has taken away from him, Jonathan Joestar sheds a tear for the man. Still, it is a victory and a well-earned one. He can finally rest, and in time, Jonathan Joestar marries the love of his life, Irina of the Pendleton family. Their bliss is short-lived, however, as while they are aboard the ship that will take them on vacation to America, the ship's inhabitants turn into zombies. Below deck, Wang Chan, who foretold Dio's destiny long ago, has Dio's head in a massive sort of jar, reminiscent of the head museum in Futurama. Dio does his typical long-winded speech as he loves to listen to himself speak, though I have to admit he did become one of the most entertaining, if not the most entertaining character in the series as far as part 1 is concerned. Even learning Araki's thought process going into the creation of Dio is a great read. Araki says he was writing the story around the time the FBI started doing research into the psychology of serial killers and learned that they commanded a certain level of control over their victims. They instilled their victims with fear and used this same fear to keep them docile and keep them from fighting back until the victim is inevitably, sadly, murdered. Dio finally recognizes Jonathan Joestar as his rival after he leaves Dio in the sorry state he's in. Dio wants to take Jojo's body for his own. He'll have Wang Chan remove his head from the rest of the corpse, and then Dio will claim it as his own. As Dio shoots the propulsion lasers from his eyes, Jojo moves slightly, protecting his face with his arms, which does rather little at all. The boat is also rocked at the same time by turbulent waves, and instead of the lasers shooting through Jojo's eyes and into his brain as intended, the lasers shoot two massive holes into his neck. Jojo uses the last of his Haman reserves to take Wang Chan out and sort of possess him, controlling him and using him to latch himself onto the ship's paddle screw shaft, which will stop the pistons from pushing out the steam, thus building up steam pressure, which will in turn cause the ship to blow like the Overlook Hotel. Though in the case of The Shining, it was the boiler room. Dio commands his zombie horde to destroy Chan's body, but by then it is already too late, and the ship explodes, taking all aboard with it, except for Irina and a babe its mother did her best to protect, and even died in that pursuit, harkening back to the beginning of the tale. Irina wanted for her life to end alongside Jojo's. She wanted to stay aboard the ship with him until the bitter end, but Jojo tells her to live, to go find happiness. He points out the abandoned babe, its mother gone onto the astral plane. He tells Irina that his mother too died, cradling him in her arms, and it's not too late to pass that favor on. Irina takes the babe and escapes into Dio's coffin, and together they float out to sea, where they are later rescued. Jonathan Joestar, who saved a young beautiful girl from bullies, the son of a wealthy man, born into luxury, never let fortune control him. Jojo was a good man in life, through and through, and he took his last breath protecting the woman he loved. I really want to end this video on Irina's words though, in reference to her late husband. Jonathan Joestar's life disappeared into oblivion. His place in history shall remain unknown to the general populace. They will never be told the tales of his noble existence, but his descendants will hear of him. Then Irina reveals she is pregnant with Jojo's child, and so ends the first part of this massive, decades-long work. I have no complaints other than it took me far too long to take this bizarre journey, and I can't wait to continue it in part 2.
By the hands of God, I stand as a wrench between your wheeling cog, fastening my belt, bracing myself to withstand against all odds. Himself shadow runners, battle ready, murder dogs. Rip the skin off your horses, triumph and smash the sorceress. Lethal forces, the failure of your ambitions is more painful than divorces. Smash your own piece on the doorway, when the door hits, that's it. Call it quits, zipped up in plastic, cremated, melted like elastic. Dreams don't mean shit, in this life they don't exist.